So the world spent the last several weeks trying to digest what a second Trump administration might mean, but of course it's not the only game in town. One of the points we've been making to our clients is that there's at least three other things going on. There's events in the world's second largest economy, China, a stimulus that everyone's been expecting, a monetary and fiscal policy support that's so far missing in action. So China's a big story. AI remains a big story, the rollout of AI in the real economy, but also the effect it's having on the stock market, particularly in the US. And I think the third and perhaps most important issue actually is what's happening with inflation. So it looked like inflation was beat, inflation was coming down. And I think by and large, inflation will continue to trend lower, particularly in Europe. But some of the recent data have perhaps thrown some sand in the wheels there and cast some doubt on that. And particularly in the US, we're starting to see unit labour costs pick up again. And the common thread running through all of Trump's agenda, immigration reform, tariffs, potentially tax cuts, although I'm sceptical, they're all inflationary in an economy that's at full employment. So I think inflation potentially in the US is something that might flare up as an issue next year.
وماذا عن الرؤية بالنسبة للمنطقة الأوروبية تحديداً التي حتى الساعة كل التوقعات تتحدث عن استمرار لضعف النمو السنة القادمة؟ ما هي توقعاتكم؟
Well, I think the outlook for Europe's challenging, but I think that's in spite of Trump rather than because of Trump. If you look at trend rates of growth, potential rates of growth in Europe's economy, it's pretty low, kind of 1%, something like that a year. And if you have an economy where the usual rate of growth is 1% a year, it doesn't take much to blow you off course. And there's obviously problems in Germany, structural decline in key parts of its really centrally important manufacturing sector. In France, the budget deficit, 6% of GDP, fiscal squeeze, the government's trying to pass fiscal tightening measures, a fiscal squeeze. Question marks as to whether that will actually go through. If not, what the bond market will do. If it does go through, it's going to affect demand and consumer spending in the economy anyway. Italy, low growth, high rates of debt, a large budget deficit. So every which way you look in Europe's major economies, with the exception of Spain, actually, Spain's doing well. But everywhere else, there are challenges. And then you overlay on top of that the threat of tariffs being imposed on European exports to the US. So, yeah, the outlook for Europe is not great. I think it's challenging, but that's not because of Trump. Europe has its own problems.
وبالنسبة للمملكة المتحدة هناك انتقادات عديدة وجدل دائر حول السياسات الاقتصادية للحكومة الجديدة. كيف تقيم أداء الحكومة حتى الساعة وما هي توقعاتك للاقتصاد البريطاني السنة القادمة؟
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are three big issues when you think about foreign investment into the UK. One is the quality of institutions, the legal system, the judiciary, and so on and so forth. I think fundamentally that's still intact. Yeah. The second is the growth story, over which there are questions. The UK economy has not fared well over the last decade. With the exception of Germany, it's been one of the weakest performers in Europe and certainly much weaker than the US. So the growth story, there's some challenges with. And then third is the tax regime. And we know that the UK is not alone in having fiscal challenges amongst advanced economies. The debt burden is high, the deficit's large, taxes are going up in order to try and close that deficit. And some of those taxes are falling on the corporate sector and on investors. Yeah. So you've got, when you think about the three pillars, the kind of institutions, the growth story and the tax implications, two of those pillars, there are some questions over, and I think that's potentially what's happening. That potentially is having an impact on foreign investment into the UK. Now, I don't think that's disastrous. I don't think they're kind of critical issues. I think they're all fixable. And I think the long-run UK growth story is still broadly intact. But this government's going to have to up its game in certain areas, and there's certain big decisions coming with respect to planning, with respect to national infrastructure, particularly around airport policy, Heathrow. Where do they stand on another runway in Heathrow? These big questions, I think, will help to define this government, and in particular its attitude towards growth, which at the end of the day is absolutely critical.